Over history, there have been figures who began their roles as performers of a role, whether in a literal or theatrical sense, or in the broader political and religious arena, only to find themselves becoming the very thing that they merely portrayed, that they merely played. And the transformation from performer to prophet, from role player to reality, is one of the most fascinating processes in history. And I'm thinking of three people. Francis of Assisi, the knight turned monk who sought peace with Saladin; Thomas a Becket, the royal administrator who became an archbishop and martyr; and Zelenskyy, the comedian who's become the wartime leader of Ukraine. And each man began in one world playing a part and found himself called to this higher purpose, and found that they embodied the role in such a way that it became indistinguishable from their very being. Francis of Assisi was at first an actor of sorts, a rich young man who delighted in revelry and sought glory and battle. There's a wonderful film by Franco Zeffirelli called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. And the son of a wealthy cloth merchant, Francis grew up surrounded by the finery of material success. Then he dreamt of knighthood, imagining himself as a chivalric hero in the grand style. He played at being a warrior fighting in a petty Italian conflict, only to be captured and imprisoned, a humiliation that shook him to the core. And upon release, he began to hear another calling, one that led him to renounce his wealth, strip naked in a public square as a gesture of the rejection of materialism, and devote himself to the service of God. But he wasn't just a mystic in a cave, he was a performer at a time of public heresy, and he was endorsed by Innocent III. His personal reenactment of Christ's poverty made him a living embodiment of the ideals that he espoused, to the point that it was marked on his flesh as well in the stigmata. His greatest performance, in the most profound sense of the word, came when he tried to end the violence of the Crusades. At the height of the Fifth Crusade, he crossed enemy lines, walked unarmed into the camp of the Sultan al-Kamil, the nephew of Saladin, and helped to broker peace, or hoped to broker peace. And this was a theatrical act in the grandest sense, or recklessly daring, almost absurdly hopeful, but it carried the weight of diplomacy alone, that diplomacy could not have done on its own. And the Sultan, intrigued by Francis's sincerity and courage, granted him an audience, and they spoke of faith, philosophy, peace. And though Francis didn't convert the Sultan, and the Sultan didn't convert Francis, there was a moment of mutual respect or human connection in a war of ideology. Francis had played the part of the holy fool, and in doing so, he became the true embodiment of peace and piety. So much so that the order of Friars Minor would later be entrusted with the guardianship of Christian sites in the Holy Land, a role that they still hold today. If Francis had played at being a knight before becoming a saint, Thomas a Becket played at being a king's man before becoming a martyr. And initially he was a consummate courtier, educated, witty, a skilled administrator, utterly devoted to King Henry II, beautifully portrayed in the film with Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole. And when Henry appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, it was with the expectation that Becket would continue to serve the crown's interest. But Becket astonished everyone, most of all the king, by undergoing a transformation. And he took his role as Archbishop not as a political appointment, but as a sacred duty. And in the film Becket in 1964, Richard Burton captures that shift brilliantly. The opening scene shows Henry, played by Peter O'Toole, undergoing penance for Becket's murder, walking barefoot through the cold stones of Canterbury Cathedral to be flogged by the monks. It's the ultimate symbol of the transformation Becket forced upon the king, a ruler who once saw the church as his subordinate and now is reduced to a public display of contrition before God. But before that moment, Becket had to suffer his own reckoning, and he resisted Henry's attacks on church authority, excommunicated royal officials, and ultimately became a man of principle rather than a political operative. His murder in Canterbury Cathedral, who will rid me of this troublesome priest, was the final act in his transformation. He played at being a servant of the king, but in resisting tyranny, he became a true servant of God. And his death was more than a tragedy, it was a dramatic statement that reshaped the medieval world. Becket was canonized within 3 years, and his tomb became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Christendom. The king who had once made him his ally was forced to do public penance for his crime. And then centuries later we get Zelenskyy, this man who didn't just play a leader on television, but became one in reality. And before 2019, Zelenskyy was famous as a comedy actor, best known for Servant of the People, in which he portrayed an ordinary teacher who, by a twist of fate, becomes president of Ukraine. And his entire campaign was infused with theatricality. His part was even named after the show, his party. And he was a populist in the literal sense of the word, an actor who had mastered the art of connecting with his audience. And many dismissed him and continue to dismiss him as a political lightweight, an entertainer who has no place in the serious affairs of state. And yet, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it was Zelenskyy, not the seasoned politicians, who became the defining figure of resistance. Like Francis, he met the challenge with symbolic actions, refusing to flee Kyiv, walking the bombed-out streets in a military T-shirt rather than a suit, standing alongside his soldiers in defiance, growing a beard until he can recognize victory. Like Beckett, he's become more than a political figure. He's become a symbol. And his speeches, delivered with the timing and the emotion of an actor who knows how to move an audience, in English, in Russian, in Ukrainian, he's galvanized world leaders. His line, "I need ammunition, not a ride," was as dramatic and effective as any scripted moment. He was no longer playing a role, he'd become the role. What unites these three men is the idea that performance, when infused with conviction, can become reality. Francis of Assisi played the role of the fool for Christ and became a saint. Thomas Becket played the loyal courtier and became a martyr. Zelenskyy played the president of the United States, played the president of Ukraine, and became a wartime leader. Each began as an imitator and ended up as the real thing, and defined the real thing in a way that nobody before that time has done. In their stories, we see that sometimes the mask we wear is not a deception but a prophecy. And if we act with sincerity, we may find that we're not pretending at all. We're simply becoming who we were meant to be. Now, whether Trump, who also has a similar trajectory from becoming famous as a reality TV star and a property mogul, to acquiring the trappings of power as the President of the United States, it's not quite the same story, and he makes significantly bigger mistakes. But he has significantly more power than Francis of Assisi, Thomas Becket, or Zelenskyy. And I'm minded to think, every time I look at Trump, I think of Marius in his madness in his 8th consulship, or I think of the tyranny of kings who have got all they wanted, kings and emperors. But I'm afraid Trump calling Zelenskyy a tyrant is foolish. Trump has simply mistaken what he's looking at in the mirror.